This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm sorry that I haven't made it to any meetings before this, but setting up home across the pond has taken more organizing than I thought. So today what I want to talk about is to sort of give some of the legal, the political, and the social complexity of what many of us take for granted, and that is the business of real estate. It's a story of profound importance for urban history, though as we'll see from the sort of materials I'm about to cover, it's a story whose boundaries escape what we would think of conventionally as the urban or the metropolitan. So I'll begin in 1900. Where delegates from numerous countries gathered in Paris to attend the first International Congress of Built Property. Among the many subjects discussed by these representatives of property ownership was the livre foncier, or the land book, a land registration system that French delegates recognized as a German invention perfected in British colonies, particularly Australia. Since 1891, a parliamentary commission had been discussing the possibility of implementing the system in metropolitan France. Elements had already been put in place in some French colonies and protectorates, where, one booster crowed, it encouraged the, quote, conversion of collective tribal lands into individual property, bringing forth trees and gardens from yesterday's wastes. If members of the Congress could acknowledge the utility of such a system for what they refer to as new countries, where property and freely contracting individuals in the properly liberal sense were understood to be lacking, they were aghast at the implications of the system for French property and French soil. Among their many objections was the conviction that the system's emphasis on the authority of the paper title would amount to a dematerialization of property, or if you prefer, a trivial materialization of property. These titles could potentially circulate in a way that real property could not. One contributor to the discussions warned that should the system be imposed, quote, no longer will property be an object of physical and exclusive appropriation of individual use value. It will have become a circulating exchange value. Another feared that, quote, once real property has in a bizarre and contradictory turn become movable, been transferred into shares, you might say, who will profit from its movement? Not the peasant. The trade in these titles won't take place on the village square between people in clogs, but in the city, on the stock exchange. As such urgent concerns indicate, the relation of real property to the realms of commerce and finance was an issue of substantial and vigorous debate in 19th century France. On the one hand, these delegates' worries about slippage between the movable and the immovable capture enduring tensions that are core to the production of space and of social relations in modern capitalism, namely the dynamic between circulating capital and fixed space, between abstraction and materialization. And of course, we have theorists from Henri Lefebvre to David Harvey to thanks for drawing our attention to the centrality of these dynamics in the production of modern capitalist relations. The Congress's prognostications about solid land melting into air, to paraphrase one of Marx's iconic statements on the modern, had a certain perennial quality. They echoed concerns that had been voiced when financiers such as John Law had proposed land banks in 1705, when revolutionaries had created a kind of territorial money in 1790, the assignat, or when a flood of petitions and proposals for money and credit based on real property overwhelmed the national legislature in the first weeks of the Revolution of 1848. Moreover, observations such as these would not have been out of place in discussions of would not be out of place in discussions of international development schemes today, many of which grant a singular power to the institutionalization of credible property rights regimes. Yet, despite commonalities in this discourse, in each of these moments, it is particular political arrangements, economic imperatives, and cultural norms that determine the way that the relationships between the movable and the immovable emerge, are institutionalized, and assume importance. These histories illuminate not only the material conditions of everyday life in a given time and place, but also the contingent ways by which general tendencies within capitalism are territorialized. Now, to further demonstrate what I mean and to introduce my goals today, let's turn to the city where these owners were meeting, Paris, and to a phenomenal building boom and bust that had a transformative effect on both its built landscape and the market life of its real property. Between 1879 and 1884, nearly 12,000 new apartment buildings, 16% of the city's residential building stock, were erected in the capital city. And what we have on the slide here is actually an effort of one architect, Paul Plana. It's half of a pair of maps in which he attempted to map the construction patterns of these years, 1879 to 1884. This particular map uses these elevation lines, these contour lines, to track the building of new housing. It's paired with another map that tracks population increase to show essentially the disjunction between the two patterns. And in fact, as a sidebar, it's a very early use of this kind of statistical mapping. I think it had only been done for the first time about 10 years beforehand by a Parisian city council member, in fact. Yet, following a stock market crash in 1882, the ruin of this fantastic boom was just as striking. As credit contracted, journalists previously agog at the entirely new districts that had been emerging from the magic wands of architects, to use a phrase that was common in the press at the time, began publishing instead scathing accounts of new urban deserts. From the Trocadero to the Parc Monceau, Le Temps reported in 1884, and those are regions in the western part of the city. One can travel entire streets that are never disturbed by the footsteps of a single visitor. The monotony of endless perspectives, the same building repeating itself in a line 50 times on either side, is broken only by signs reading, "For rent, water and gas on all floors." A municipal official remarked that in no other period, and I'm quoting, has the dynamic of construction and demolition enacted such significant changes in the condition of land in such a short span of time. The tenor of some of these changes was captured in an 1884 parliamentary report on the status of commerce and industry in the country at large, but which dedicated a very significant portion of its investigations to the construction industry in Paris, given the importance of that industry to the nation's economy. And one of their observations was that, quote, "The modern building sector is less industry than it is commerce. Transactions are constant, erasing, as it were, the original production. For the public at large, the building entrepreneur is a merchant, almost a broker, just like the head of a department store." The assessment captured a novel development in the market situation of real property and was becoming commonplace, with architects lamenting that the public's taste for the ready-made had encouraged them to equate real estate with goods on department store shelves. And soon, with merchandise marts such as the Grand Magasin du Fayel, proposing real estate departments for the pleasure and convenience of their clientele. That real property, land and buildings, could come to be seen and treated as merchandise in a department store was no straightforward affair in 19th century France. Historians focus on the role of state authorities in urban development, particularly on Baron Haussmann and Napoleon III's renovation of the city of Paris between 1853 and 1870, has obscured the multitude of individuals and imperatives engaged in establishing the system of property relations in the capital, from property owner associations to professionalizing real estate agents to developers like Paul Foucault, here advertising his eager assumption of the imperatives of modern capitalist entrepreneurialism. This is a gazette that he introduced in 1877 when he had reached the ripe age of 25, showing Parisian land divided into streets and sales lots surrounded by this capitalist credo, "Time is money," in English. Tracing how real property came to act as a commercial object in the spaces of the city and the portfolios of investors requires acknowledging these agents and interventions, opening up the business networks, financial arrangements, and the political and social ambitions that structured the production, distribution, and consumption of Parisian property. It requires reading the familiar from boulevards to apartment buildings in unfamiliar ways, and adding new sources to our pantheon of urban texts. The publicity journals and advertising columns of real estate developers and agents, the rental contracts of property owners, the annual shareholder reports of property management and investment firms, the shares and bonds of limited liability corporations and mortgage institutions, the scribbled surveys of municipal tax assessors. The payoff is not only a new account of the political and economic stakes as well as the social experience of city building during a crucial period of urbanization, it's also an account of real estate as a social product and a terrain of contestation that helps trace the changing regulatory environment of state capitalism at the turn of the 20th century. Now, the constellation of agents and institutions shaping the marketization of real property in France while influenced by international trends and models, was unique to that country. For instance, real estate agents, whose offices proliferated in the last decades of the 19th century, shaped their brokering practices and their occupational identities in relation to those of public notaries. These were legal officials who enjoyed monopolies in some areas of property transfer. They also had to shape their practices in accordance with a market culture that prized specialization as a hallmark of reliable commercial performance. More broadly, the country's legal regime provided a powerful vocabulary and structuring framework within which reforms to the commercial standing of real estate were worked out. Real property was the quintessential bien immobilier, or immovable good. Legal distinctions established by the Napoleonic Code at the outset of the 19th century separated it by its nature and by its productive capacities from movable goods, or mobilier. This distinction not only established the two great halves of property law into which all goods could and were divided, it expressed the essence of the distinction between the civil and the commercial jurisdictions. And the authors of the code, writing in 1803 and 1804, would frequently describe how if you looked at the essence of what an immovable good is, if you looked at a piece of real property, there you would understand sort of this, obviously not their term, my term, an ontology that would help really describe this essence of what it is that counted as a market object or a market relation and what counted as a social one. While real property could of course be bought and sold, it could not then in these legal terms be subject to commerce. And there were consequences to this. This meant a lack of access to things like bankruptcy for property owners. It meant you had to go to a different court. It meant different kinds of evidence had to come up if there were any sorts of conflicts regarding real property. As a result, property moved more slowly through different circuits and institutions of transfer and with different rules of exchange to those of other goods. In the eyes of the code, real property was patrimony to be protected from the market rather than an asset whose circulation should be encouraged. Today, I want to trace some of the practices and the anxieties of a commerce in real estate in late 19th century France, focusing on the intersection of real estate and financial markets. Historians have largely followed contemporaries in sidelining a consideration of real estate as patrimonial capitalism transitioned to industrial and financial capitalism. Yet the ongoing dialogue between real property and finance is an important and a persistent factor in the institutional and imaginative construction of both modern economies and modern states. These markets were understood to be in a contest for middle-class savings from the mid-19th century onwards. They collided in the offices of the real estate broker, in the halls of new lending bodies established in the 1870s and 80s, in the pockets of developers as sales options circulated between firms, and in the portfolios of increasingly modest investors as financial mechanisms turned stones to paper. Projects to reorganize the conditions of property exchange, which were proposed by ambitious real estate agents, by journalists who began chronicling something they could call the property market in the 1880s, these were made intelligible by broader transformations in investment patterns and business forms. Climbing steadily from the 1880s, stocks and bonds surpassed real property in the portfolios of French investors by the period of the Great War. Far from simply reflecting the movement of investment capital from a less dynamic to a more fluid arena, the increased prominence and popularity of stock market engagement encouraged fundamental alterations in the nature and the status of real property ownership as well. Now, for contemporaries, the nearly conjoined crash in the stock market, which occurs in 1882 and ushers France definitively into this worldwide economic depression, which had begun with the Panic of 1873, and the downturn in the building industry, provided a clear indication of the intimate connections between the two realms, not only in terms of financial capital, but in terms of the mechanisms of exchange and, more broadly, the imperatives and values that seemed to be at work in both realms. Parisian developers had taken unprecedented advantage of the limited liability joint stock business form as a mode of unifying associates and amalgamating capital. And we can see the traces of these companies today, though this is in fact a company from the early 20th century, not from the 1880s. It just happened to be a photo that I had. Freed from the requirement of state authorization since 1867, more than 250 such firms were founded for the, quote, purposes of speculation. This is the phrase that normally appears in company statutes, between 1870 and 1900. 93 of these were formed between 1880 and 1882, and this is just for the capital city. As many workers' representatives reflected bitterly during the building crisis, these arrangements allowed projects to begin on the basis of a capital that was more imaginary than real. When you form a joint stock limited liability company, you don't need to pay in all the capital that you say you have. You only need to pay in a quarter. It left these companies vulnerable to changes in credit conditions. Indeed, while real estate development generally involved credit of some kind, the building boom of the late 1870s was more thoroughly reliant on debt arrangements than others. Developers deployed a new kind of purchase option, which had not been widely used previously, and allowed them to borrow against land they did not yet own. And you can trace these. This is a notary contract. This is the developer whose Paris time is money crest I showed you earlier. This is a sales contract in which he, as a developer, has approached a property owner, though in this particular case, the property owner likely also approached him. He was he was a person eager to have his land developed. And what the cession d'antériorité essentially means is that you have agreed as a property owner to cede your rank in the mortgage queue. So that I, as a developer, can approach you as a property owner. You say, I agree to be reimbursed second if this all goes belly up. You pay me a very generous monthly rent for the land. And by the end of the period, when this is all resold, you enact the option to purchase, and we both hopefully make money. The benefit to the property developer, and the reason that these could trade between developers is because they came with access to, or essentially they granted you the means to access a newly perfected system of credit institutions, which I'll describe now in a moment, and essentially would only lend to developers in first position. They would only lend if the property owner had essentially made this agreement to leave that most secure place as a creditor on the land. The key players in the system were the Crédit Foncier, the nation's central mortgage bank, and the Sous-Comptoir des Entrepreneurs, the principal lender to the building industry. Both had been founded in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, the result of an outpouring of demands for radical reforms of economic life that included, amongst other measures, the abolition of debtors' prison, the democratization of credit, and the right to work. In 1879 and 1881, the Crédit Foncier created two additional investment bodies to supplement its operations. And you can see precisely that those are the years, obviously, when there's a tremendous jump in the amount of credit that's being given to both owners of property and to developers is increasing. The Compagnie Foncière de France was a company that provided urban land against which developers could borrow from the Sous-Comptoir. It aimed to make its money on the higher price developers would pay once they had finished the construction. The company's administrators described their method in stock market lingo as buying on the spot and selling forward. The Rente Foncière, which is at the other end of this assembly line, was intended to buy up the best of the new properties and to manage them. Studying this network in 1881, financial columnist Alexia Yates observed that, quote, no arrangement in recent times has done more to facilitate the construction of buildings in Paris, to increase their price and returns, to develop a considerable level of transactions. The efficacy and blinding speed of the system led one pamphleteer to compare it to, quote, those prodigious Chicago machines where pigs enter alive and exit a few hours later as hawks and blood sausage, or in this case, as the speculative streetscapes of the city's West End. This quantitative increase in activity also signaled changes of a qualitative order. In the words of André Cochou, economist and director of Paris's municipal pawn shop, one of the city's most important financial bodies, land had become a, quote, exchangeable title, divorced from its materiality, operating according to the logic of the stock market, and to continue the, quote, its illusion of inexhaustible wealth. In the distribution of their equity and debt instruments, their shares and their bonds, property investment firms married movable and immovable property. And I have here just an example of what one of these shares would have looked. This is a share of the Société Anonyme du Quartier Marbeuf, which in fact built the street that I showed you in the previous slide. Courts had difficulty parsing their status as civil or commercial entities, recognizing, as the Parisian Commercial Court did as early as 1868, that these certificates, quote, effectively transform real assets into easily transmissible movables, circulating from hand to hand in accordance with legal understandings of merchandise. Yet, they presented a new horizon for real estate investment that both the legal system and investment advocates worked to assimilate. To return to this financial observer I quoted earlier, Alexia Yates, he observed in 1881 again that, quote, clear public sentiment favors the movable form as today's preferred mode of participating in property ownership, making land, the buildings it supports, the revenues it generates, into paper shares that can be folded and placed in a wallet, into, paper that can be passed from hand to hand, seems the highest form of progress. Fractional ownership in the form of investment in a recommended property firm promised to overcome the main obstacles to real estate investment, namely that properties were expensive, that they required time-consuming management, and that they were difficult to liquidate quickly. Mechanisms of the stock exchange could help mitigate these inconveniences, providing flexibility while retaining the stability and solidity of real property. Real estate man J.B. Boisselot, this is one of his promotional flyers here, was the founder of a company he called La Mobilisation Foncière, or land mobilization. He proposed a stock company that would divide revenues amongst shareholders for each building included in his scheme, which would, quote, make real estate investments accessible to everyone. In sales materials, he insisted frequently on the specificity and tangibility of the individual buildings, inviting investors to visit them, to see for themselves how they were managed, contrasting them sharply with other more distant and dubious investments available on the exchange. Real property, it was argued, could be enhanced rather than dissipated through these movable titles. Reviewing Boisselot's projects, Paris's Chamber of Properties, the capital's largest property owner association, founded in 1872, welcomed them as, quote, the democratization of real estate investment. They saw in these titles a broadening of the tasks and the interests of proprietorship that could only bolster the strength of property owners vis-a-vis the demands of the state. Their appeal and legitimacy was such that by the turn of the century, you could see the formation of property investment firms aimed specifically at the working classes. And this is this is a call for shareholders and a version of a report from the Fourmi Immobilière, founded in 1899, a company that entertained its shareholders with the story of a young boy asking his grandfather to, quote, buy me 100 francs worth of house. Boosters argued that combinations like these had a further virtue. They could replace the obscurity of property valuation with transparent and objective pricing. Once transformed into stock quotes, real property took on a value that one promoter described as, quote, precise and incontrovertible, determined and declared each day by stock exchange prices, and which thus can be subject to neither manipulation nor to fraud. Mechanisms of the exchange could grant property the publicity necessary to achieve reliable pricing. This is one of the necessary conditions that helps a good qualify as a commercial good according to the commercial code. It's significant in this perspective that the earliest mentions of a market in real estate in daily newspapers, so a market in immobilier rather than a market in buildings or a market in land, occur in reference to the shares and bonds of property investment companies trading on the exchange. Now, from legibility in the financial life of property to the legibility of the city streets, the stock market became a key element of the organizational discourse and distributional models of those who took deciphering the city's housing as their raison d'etre, urban real estate agents. From the 1870s, these agents were emerging from the obscurity of both unspecialized commercial mediation and from their unsung role as collaborators to solicitors and notaries who enjoyed monopolies over portions of real property exchange. And we can capture something of their professionalization here to look at an early representation of the agent d'affaires, or the estate agent in the 1840s, referred to in one career guide as the living embodiment of advertising columns. Here he's putting up an ad for an investment of some sort, which surely on this dark street is not going to be a reputable one, to something somewhat more familiar by the end of the century. This is in fact a template advertising poster, not for any particular agency, but which would have left you space to fill in the details of your own agency there at the top. Their progressively more assertive interventions into real estate were accompanied by promises of an improved market model to that guarded by the city's 122 notaries, whose weekly property auctions were described by one critic in 1880 as, quote, primitive, rudimentary, repellent, bureaucratic, expensive, and generally repulsive for modest purses. In their place, agents proposed their offices as an unofficial, unceasing marketplace. And that's a phrase from one of the efforts in the early 20th century that real estate agents undertook to achieve official government regulation of their field. Brokerage names and gazette mastheads frequently deployed the term exchange, evoking the centralization, specialization, and the incessant encounter of supply and demand that would, it was thought, achieve an efficient market. We can see this, for example, this is the letterhead of the Agence Lagrange, which became a substantial real estate interest into the interwar period, here advertising their very prominent location at an intersection in close proximity to the building in the rear of this image is the stock exchange. Along with their methodical presentations, their maps, their shorthand codes, their expert counsel, estate agents promised to demystify the increasingly complex spaces of the city, preventing useless expenditures of time and money. Now, to look more deeply at how the intersections of real property and finance were managed in practice, the agency of Jean-Arthur Tiffin is instructive. Reorganized as a limited liability venture in 1884, it immediately introduced a new service called the Real Estate Transactions Exchange. As the agency explained, the real estate crisis of the early 1880s had revealed the inadequacies of what passed for a property market. Then one of the debut editorials noted that, quote, all stocks, state securities, shares and bonds in corporations, any and all types of goods and commodities have central sites, exchanges, markets where supply and demand meet. There is nothing similar for real estate. Nothing is organized. Everything is abandoned to accident, to chance circumstance, to random, fortuitous encounters. Thus, the agency proposed, of course, its own offices as a, quote, exchange, concentrating supply and demand for all real estate business. Now, to realize these goals of consolidating and rationalizing property transfer, Jean-Arthur Tiffin's Bourse operated with the help of innovative urban texts. Its Grand Journal Officiel was a lavish gazette that debuted in 1884 and was among the first to introduce both floor plans and color advertising to the Parisian property marketplace. And this is an image from a later date, I think it's 1910, yes. But in fact, the cover of the journal changed very little in this period, and this is just the only one I was allowed to photograph. This journal helped create a new visual register for the consumption of built space, literally rendering the city transparent, integrating the domestic interior within the circuits of consumerism defining the modern city. Its opinion pieces and advice articles address the particular situation of the city's real property in the aftermath of the building bubble, noting that an abundance of housing stock, combined with the intervention of new corporate proprietors such as insurance and real estate development companies, required a reorientation on the part of property owners, who, the journal opined, were, quote, formerly rentiers receiving steady revenues from their rents, but today are bona fide retailers. The columnist continued, tenants go to the most skillful, to those who know how to attract them with clever publicity, and their right to do so. Apartments having become trade goods, they ought to be offered like merchandise. But perhaps the firm's more ambitious intervention was its Guide Foncier, or its land guide, published in 1886. Announcing on its first page that, quote, property has a rate just like shares in the stock exchange, this guide compiled property values in the city of Paris over the previous 20 years. It was adopted by the Parisian Municipal Council as a reference guide for its planning discussions and debates, and it formed one of the key data sets of sociologist Maurice Halbach's important study of Parisian land values, published in 1909. It is a particularly influential example of a new type of real estate guide that emerged at the end of the 19th century and consisted entirely of compilations of data on real estate sales. And again, I don't have an image of Jean-Arthur Tiffin's Guide Foncier, but there were several others published just after their guide, and this is one, an annual compilation by Maxime Petitbon, who ran a competing real estate agency, and in the final years between the 1880s and the early 20th century, published several versions of guides that looked like this. The appearance of such volumes is important to understanding the market for real property in the capital city. On the face of it, these guides had a straightforward, practical goal, namely providing the data necessary to determine average values through informed comparison. Yet their existence and organizational form also had a more fundamental impact. In the pages of these volumes, the incomparable became comparable, and the disparate transaction of dissimilar goods congealed into something that looked like a market. Exchange appeared constant, goods readily marketable. Price guides established records of market activity, granting the market a diachronic existence, and they reinforced an understanding of property prices as relative and historical rather than intrinsic. They also supplied the information necessary to compose readers into the calculative actors demanded by the marketplace. Alongside the appearance of daily newspaper columns tracking real estate transactions and chronicling an entity called the real estate market, these guides brought awareness of property prices to a broader public. Like stock market summaries, guides fonciers worked to document and to inform on the expected performance of a piece of land. Now, the degree to which the behavior of real property could be successfully subjected to these technologies of calculation and evaluation did not go uncontested. Even as price guides proposed an unprecedented transparency for the multitude of transactions that might comprise a city's property market, their ability to adequately capture the fluctuating dynamics they illuminated was disputed. For instance, the municipal council was quite divided on the virtues of subscribing to John-Arthur Étuffin's Guide Foncier. While enthusiasts for the volume, and I should say they're divided on it because he wants 10 francs per volume and the city council wants to buy 100 copies. So it's actually a rather large expenditure, which is why there's a debate about it. While enthusiasts for the volume saw it as a precious aid for public works decisions, opponents worried that it would quickly become out of date, its status as a sort of archive making it unsuitable to the rapidly changing realm of real estate exchange. Councillor Athanase Bassinet drew on his experience and likely also his interests as a public works entrepreneur, opposing the purchase of the volume because, in his view, quote, the value of land is fluctuating by nature, varying from day to day, and depends on changes in neighboring properties. From this perspective, a historical evaluation of prices could do little to inform potential buyers, as at the moment of transaction could return a price out of all proportion with expectation. Properties then remained fundamentally incomparable, and localized circumstances could thwart predictability. Moreover, property's distribution remained profoundly political. One of the volume's proponents in the council, a socialist named Alexandre Paulard, backed subscription because he contended that the volume provided proof of the inexorable increase in Parisian land values, which had been illicitly appropriated by property owners by virtue of their monopolistic control of land. Now, recognition of such uncertainty, if it was sufficient to consistently undercut any idea of a coherent market, did little to displace the broader impression of real property as a stable, long-term investment. If the stock market provided influential models and tools for understanding the commerce in real estate provided some of the most important means of expanding the purchase of the financial marketplace in the pockets and imaginations of French savers. Here, if I may, we return to the Crédit Foncier, one of the country's leading financial institutions. Founded, as I mentioned, in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, the Crédit Foncier was dedicated to loans secured on real estate. They were payable in annual installments at moderate rates of interest over long terms of 20 or 30 years. By the end of this period, they'll be issuing mortgages that have terms for 75 years. If you want to compare this with what a mortgage looks like, for instance, in the United States in this period, these are dramatically different. A mortgage in the US would have been a 4 or 5 year commitment with a balloon payment at the end. This is seen as a very progressive measure. And the Crédit Foncier is founded explicitly, though it will not live up to this expectation, as a means of helping the overly indebted French countryside. It supported its lending operations by the creation of securities backed on this mortgage debt. I have an example of one of these bonds here. Its first president and fervent proselytizer for land credit, the Polish expatriate and economist Louis Wolowski, described these instruments as the paper manifestation of real estate. If we are to mobilize property, he wrote, its essence must be captured in this representative sign. The paper that it generates must produce interest, just as land produces revenue. That these bonds represented claims on a pool of debt, rather than on a particular mortgaged property, was an innovation that made specific legal contracts into generalizable obligations. From the 1860s, the Crédit Foncier's bonds gained tremendous popularity thanks to a further innovation. These are the addition of lottery chances to the normal revenue stream of the bond. They consequently were known as lottery bonds. And we have an example here. You can see that every year, 2 people are going to win 200,000 francs if their bond gets drawn. With the assistance of such bonuses, the Crédit Foncier had placed 1.5 billion francs worth of debt amongst hundreds of thousands of bondholders by the late 1870s. They doubled this amount to 3 billion francs by 1890. Now, the lottery bond drawings of the Crédit Foncier were highly orchestrated and widely publicized events. gathering crowds of hopeful bondholders several times a year to witness the turning of specially designed drums in the company's imposing Parisian headquarters. And one of the particular reasons I like this image is because of this crowd of, it was, as we can see, a modest crowd of, well, a substantial crowd of modest individuals in the foreground of the image, and the well-besuited officials of the Crédit Foncier behind the table. These bonds capitalized on their secure basis in that most fundamental of assets, real property, and helped transform it into a widely accessible investment. Economists, politicians, and business interests who favored increasing the participation of small savers in the market approved of these bonds as a gateway asset that initiated the modest and the unsophisticated to the world of investment. Yet their proximity to a lottery, illegal in France since 1836 and associated particularly with lower class entertainment, raised persistent concerns about the legitimacy and the morality of these instruments. And we can see that obviously, this is an image of the drawing of the Royal Lottery in the 18th century. We can see that clearly these are, they're borrowing from the practices of the lottery very directly. Like down to the children that are turning the drums, which in the image on the left would have been, these are wards of the state. These are, in the image on the right, they're wards of the state. In the image on the left, they're deserving scholars, young students, who are seen to be innocent and so, can be trusted with drawing the bonds from these drums. Investors gained the opportunity for unexpected bonanzas, yes, but they paid for this chance with lower annual dividends. If elite politicians were condescending and declaring lottery bonds irresistible to the lower classes, they were right to worry that when cities or large operations of national importance like the Suez or the Panama Canal deployed such bonds, the costs of public works were being increasingly borne by society's poorer members. And, very troublingly, their popularity also sprang from an array of operations and schemes that, while dramatically increasing the bond's accessibility, skirted the edges of ethical commerce. The Crédit Foncier's lottery bonds were a preferred piece of merchandise for securities retailers that fanned across the country in the 1880s. Itinerant brokers and shady agencies invented ingenious and often illegal sales tactics. They sliced these bonds into fractions. I have an image here. This is the sale of a tenth of a Crédit Foncier bond. They crafted installment payment plans. They perfected option sales, which meant that you could buy a lottery bond just for the days of the drawing, and then sell it back to the agency if you were not successful. This is a tremendous concern to something like the Crédit Foncier de France into the interwar period, when the fact that the franc is now worth so much less than it had been before, and these are being sold around the world simply as lottery tickets. So it's very interesting to look at the Crédit Foncier's archives and to see how they try to police, what's happening to their bonds in Argentina, where they're just being sold on the street as lottery tickets. Each alteration of the bond heightened its proximity to a pure lottery, an economic practice that distorted liberal visions of a masterable self and a masterable world. Nevertheless, explaining their popularity amongst modest investors and defending their utility, liberal economist Paul Leroy-Beaulieu stated bluntly in 1877 that, quote, exciting a taste for savings amongst ignorant people sometimes requires more than the promise of 3 or 3.5% interest. He continued, the lottery bond has been for our urban populations what the parcel of land has been for the peasant, something that makes saving attractive, that turns it into a dream, appealing not only to the reason but to the imagination. For Leroy-Beaulieu, the stories told by these practices remained stories of proprietorship. The imaginary of ownership lingered on these pieces of paper, not erased but transferred, spreading land ownership's seemingly unique ability to engender financial and affective investment in the nation. The economist was relatively untroubled by the fact that these particular stories of property privileged luck and windfalls over just rewards for labor. Yet the crowds that flooded the lottery hall of the Crédit Foncier, hoping for fortune to smile on them, seem more poignant when placed alongside the agricultural crisis that gripped the country in the 1880s and 90s, resulting in a meteoric rise in land repossession and widespread rural depopulation. Now, the lottery bond reveals how both the lottery and real property functioned as a constitutive and innovative rather than residual and archaic elements of the expansion of financial markets. Real estate's articulation with financial markets was a subject of constant negotiation, as new sources of wealth were found in the gap between real property's fixed existence and its circulating values. Instruments like lottery bonds familiarized an increasingly broad demographic with the revenue-generating potential of real estate, while also contributing to the persuasiveness of the stock market, the market par excellence, as a model for the organization of real property exchange, while thus helping to make the productive capacity of real assets ever more prominent in the portfolios of individual savers. The increased mobilization of real estate capital heightened its status as an object of exchange and as an object suited to exchanges. But real property not only moved closer to commerce in the 19th century, understandings of what counted as commerce and a market evolved under the influence of its changing status. The vision of markets that informed legal definitions of commerce at the outset of the century were rooted in the physical encounter of supply and demand. Markets were places where you met, you transferred a clearly priced commodity from hand to hand. These are all important phrases in constituting a market. As immovable real estate was increasingly treated as if it was movable merchandise, this vision changed. In its place emerged a more expansive conception of markets as contractual networks without predetermined boundaries. This change is striking in legal terms, and it might be interpreted as a definitive move towards a regime of abstract exchangeability characteristic of market relations under capitalism. But this tendency towards leveling the embeddedness of property relations should not be mistaken for its realization. Pushback against the innovations discussed here and the broader interest in forming them came from many quarters, and in fact, this paper opened with people who were pushing back against the exchangeability of land. The material immobility of land and its non-reproducibility, the legal frameworks that structured its exchange, as well as the political, the cultural weight placed upon proprietorship in the French Republic, all of these continually contested efforts to more thoroughly commercialize its conditions of distribution and circulation. These persistent entanglements stymie and shape the calculative practices that define economic objects, from apartment buildings to lottery bonds. They also lie at the heart of the process of urbanization, the historical specificity of which my research on Paris seeks to illuminate. Approaching Parisian real estate as a social product, populated by the likes of hitherto unstudied individuals like Paul Foucault, the real estate developer, Jonathan Tiffin, the real estate agent, or these crafty yet as yet nameless salesmen of lottery bonds, reveals not only a new range of actors and imperatives at work in remaking the city, but also new frontiers and boundaries of commercialization and consumerism underwriting the both modern urban and business culture of 19th century France. The spaces and social relations of real estate provided arenas in which the productivity of money and of property became a lived reality, and their history, I believe, is vital to understanding both the making of markets and the making of people invested in them. Thank you.